you're just joining us, please tell us who you are, whether you use graphic organizers, and if you know anything about biofabrication from 1 to 5. But what are we going to do here today? We don't have a very long period, and I'm already getting the go-ahead by Kara because we've got some fun things we want you to play with. And that's the most important thing, is for you to actually be able to play with the tools that we've developed. So let's talk about what we're going to do. We're going to learn a little bit about the Corgi application itself, how to actually use it. We're going to give you an opportunity to do that. We're going to understand how it relates to STEAM education. And again, the most important part is that you're going to get the experience to use Corgi here today. So if you want to advance the slide. So again, what is Corgi? What is Corgi? What's the background of the project? How does it relate to what we're doing in STEAM? And give you an opportunity to try it out. So what is Corgi? Well, Corgi is an interesting product because it takes something that is somewhat complex and tries to make it simple, right? We know that scientific literacy and higher order reasoning skills are increasingly important in today's society. And so what we know in our classrooms is that that's sometimes hard to teach, especially for students with learning disabilities who have lower rates of participation and achievement in science courses and STEM courses overall, and that students with disabilities, by and large, are less likely to pursue STEM degrees and STEM careers. And so we went into this project many years ago thinking about how do we design a project or design an app that will support scientific literacy and higher order thinking for students with disabilities. And that was really critically important. And then how do we support those lower rates of participation by increasing the rates of participation and achievement for students with disabilities in these STEM courses? And then hopefully, the idea being that we encourage students with disabilities to use their STEM skills to pursue degrees and careers in STEM education, STEAM education. So we were really excited and challenged by this from the very beginning, and started to kind of move through this process with a focus on those areas. Kara, do you want to? There we go. So our approach is critically important. So what we knew going into this is that the University of Kansas and others had a long history in using graphic organizers to support higher order thinking and to support competencies in STEM and STEAM education. So our goal was to develop graphic organizers, but make them to be used in flexible and new and innovative sort of ways, to make them completely accessible. Because historically, as you see in the image right to the right there, is that historically graphic organizers were paper-based. And while we had great research around those graphic organizers, they could do amazing things in the STEM and STEAM fields. What we were lacking was the ability for students to be able to access them in new and flexible ways, to be able to use them in accessible ways. And so our approach was to take what we knew about these graphic organizers and make them more accessible and more flexible. So hence we came up with the Corgi, or what we call co-organize your learning. And what is important about Corgi is that it builds upon what we know about great accessibility, as well as it supports flexible ways of learning. So throughout the pandemic, for instance, as people were online, or even as you're still flipping in and out of digital and blended or even hybrid learning environments, Corgi is designed for those environments. Corgi is designed for any environment, and it's supported to be flexible. It's supported and based on universal design for learning. And it's based as a responsive web app in Google's platform and can be used very easily in a Google Classroom. And we designed it knowing that the budgets were constrained and that teachers and educators across the land needed something that was free, and that was not going to, by the way, not going to like steal your data. And so as a research organization, we designed an app with all these things in consideration. So we have a number of project partners. Obviously, we've talked about CAST already. I'm from the University of Kansas, and we have other partners from the University of Kansas. Haiti's from the University of Kansas. And that's where a lot of the research has been conducted over the last 2 decades on graphic organizers in STEM education, STEAM education. Obviously, Santa Clara County Office of Education, Evergreen Evaluation and Consulting, and SRI International also helping with the research. So let me tell you about some early findings that we've had with Corgi, which is, they're absolutely amazing, absolutely amazing. There was an independent pilot evaluation that was conducted some years ago with over 500 students, both in science and US history. Here's what we know, is that the students with disabilities who used Corgi in science and history performed better than expected. In fact, had significant outcomes. In those areas. And if we wanted to get into the data, we could go very deep into the data. In fact, we showed that all students, in fact, had significant outcomes, and that we saw effect sizes of 0.95 in some areas, which if you're a researcher, that is extraordinary. Much better than expected outcomes. So our early data in the version 1 of Corgi that we've created, we've had immense outcomes. Now we've taken what we've learned in version 1 and have created a new version of it to make it more widely acceptable and usable by a greater number of people. So let's take some time and talk about what we're doing with Corgi and STEAM education.
Thanks, Jamie. So I'm really excited to talk about the connection between STEAM and using Corgi. So the reason that these work so well together is that we've designed Corgi to really align with the NGSS practices and the cross-cutting concepts, because the routines in Corgi really closely mirror some of those practices. Currently in Corgi, we've got the cause and effect guide, the compare and contrast guide, the question exploration guide, which really helps students break down a complex essential question. And the most recently added one is claim evidence reasoning, which can help students build their skills toward scientific argumentation. So the fact that all of these routines are available in Corgi makes it a perfect fit for teaching in a STEM classroom. And I just wanted to throw it over to Jennifer briefly to talk a little bit more about the connection there.
Sure, thanks, Kara. So just for those of you who may not be familiar with the next generation science standards, a quick overview is that there's 3-dimensionality to these standards, and they do incorporate all the other standards as well. So there are ELA connections and math connections. So that's where Corgi also fits into having this useful tool to help with all areas for those of you who maybe are elementary teachers. And it's really important. We'll give you these links, but it's good to understand the science and engineering practices, which are what scientists do. It's really about how to do the hands-on and how to how they're thinking about science. So this is again where this tool is useful to really allow for students to put their thoughts down and understand, when they're looking at phenomenon in science and thinking. And then the cross-cutting concepts are a little bit newer for some folks, but those are really about kind of, again, making connections, right? Connecting things to their thinking. And what's awesome here is that there's a lot of support with cause and effect and compare and contrast, which is like those higher order thinking pieces that are part of the cross-cutting concept. So those are 2 of the 3 dimensions. And the 3rd dimension are the DCIs, which is really your content. So that's what we're familiar with from prior science standards. So it's, again, a really great way to support students' thinking and to support them with grappling with phenomenon and using this tool. So that's why we're excited to share it with you. So thanks.
Thanks, Jennifer. So in going back to one of the pieces of data that Jamie cited earlier, we know that students with learning disabilities are less likely to pursue careers in STEM. So that's something that we really want to overcome here. And one of the ways that we're hoping to do that is by making these complex STEAM concepts more accessible to students through the use of a tool like Corgi, which helps really break down these concepts into chunked bite-sized pieces that are going to make it a little bit more approachable for certain students. And in doing so, we're hoping that it really does build their self-confidence in these areas so that they might try to take another class in STEAM that they may not have, felt confident taking before. And, with that comfort, hopefully will come a rise in more students being comfortable with even pursuing careers in STEAM. So that's our ultimate goal with this tool. And we're hoping that, these steps can actually move the dial on that piece of data that, we really want to do something about. All right. So in talking about the disciplinary core ideas in NGSS, one thing we want to think about is how can we bring in some really engaging content for students that's going to kind of, be a hook and wet their whistle so that they really do want to engage with STEAM, because some of this stuff is really exciting. It's innovative, it's emerging. And one of those areas that we decided to explore through Corgi is the concept of biofabrication. Which some folks probably have never heard of before. So we'll do a quick introduction into what is biofabrication anyway. And I think you'll learn really quickly why students are so excited about this topic, because it is so cool. It's almost science fiction, but it's becoming a reality. And it's also an area where there's going to be an enormous amount of job opportunities coming online in the next 5 to 10 years. So by the time our middle school students are graduating from high school, this could be a very real career opportunity for them. So building their awareness of it now is the perfect time to get them interested. So we're going to talk a little bit about how biofabrication is going to impact the future of healthcare. And this lesson that we're going to share today is, really suited to middle school or high school. And one of the nice things about Corgi is that you can really customize it to make it, age appropriate for whatever age group you're teaching. So you guys are all welcome to use this lesson and all of the content that we've included today. And the aligning standard that works well with this particular lesson is the Biological Evolution, Unity, and Diversity standard. And we're specifically going to be thinking about, and I think this is the cool part, right? It's the way humans have been able to, change organisms. And in this case, by using technology, really change the outcome of people's diseases. So there's a good connection for NGSS. And we're going to get to try it out. So before we get started with Corgi, I just want to go through the quick process of how you access this tool. So as Jamie mentioned before, it's a free tool, free to use. The only thing you need is a Google account. And one thing that's really important as we go through this step is the process of authorizing your account with Corgi. And I just want to make sure that everybody who tries this is familiar with this step, because this is the connection that Corgi is going to make to your Google account so that all of the content, all of the products that you produce through Corgi are going to be saved directly to your Google Drive, which makes it, completely cloud-based. You don't have to download anything. There's no app to download. It's all online, and students can access it from any device anywhere as long as they have their Google account. So it's really convenient in that regard, but in order to make that work, you do need to authorize your account with Corgi. So let's take a look at what that process looks like. So when you go to the Corgi homepage, so that's corgi.cast.org, and maybe one of my colleagues can throw that in the chat. So we've got that for you guys to click on, and you say log in with your Google account, you're going to come to this permission box. And this is really crucial, because if you don't give Corgi permission to access your Google Drive, we won't be able to store the Corgi routines in your Google Drive, and the app isn't going to work for you. So it's just really crucial that everybody goes through this step. And unfortunately, Google doesn't allow us to sort of pre-populate these boxes. It's one of those things that every user has to opt into, which again is another way of protecting your data. This is all opt-in. So we just want to make sure that you're comfortable with what you are signing up for here. And if you go ahead and check all of these unchecked boxes and then hit continue, that's going to make the necessary connections so that Corgi is going to work with your Google account. And of course, this is completely, it's a temporary permission. So if you ever want to discontinue your connection to Corgi, you can do that through your Google account as well. So it's not a permanent connection. So if you want to try it out today, and then you can deactivate it tomorrow if you want to. But we hope you don't. We hope you use Corgi in your classrooms. All right, so just that said, let's go ahead and jump into the cause and effect guide. So I'm going to pop out of the Google slideshow here and open up Corgi's cause and effect. And I've already previously logged into Corgi with my Google account, so mine is already authorized and ready to go. But one thing I do want you to see is that when you open up Corgi and somebody has shared a guide with you, if they've given you permission to open the guide, it may be a view-only copy. And this is just like a Google Doc works. So in order to edit that copy, you're going to want to go ahead and make a copy that's your own. So then everybody owns their own version of it. And this is the same as the way you would share a guide with your students. You can send them out a view-only link, and then every student can make a copy, and that'll be their own personalized version. So they're not going to be, overwriting each other. The other opportunity, though, is that you can have students collaborate in real time, just like any Google Docs. So if you do want to have students work in pairs or small groups, you could certainly do that as well. But for the purposes of this demo, we're going to have everybody work on their own individual copy. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to say make a copy, and it's going to ask me to rename it. So I'm just going to say Kara's biofabrication copy. And now I'm making my own personal copy of the document. All right. So here we are on the home page of the cause and effect guide. And you'll see on the left-hand side, it runs through all of the steps involved in doing a cause and effect routine in Corgi. So it starts with the essential question. Then we talk about the main idea. So that's like what happened, right? And then we're going to talk about the causes of the main idea. And then we're going to think about the connection between the causes and the main event. So we're kind of naming that relationship and putting a term to that. And then we're going to do the same with the effects. We're going to think about, okay, what was the outcome that happened as a result of the main event? And then we'll name that relationship as well. And then finally, we'll circle back after having gone through all those steps and revisit our essential question in order to formulate a summary. So we're going to do a few of these steps together. And you'll see on the right-hand side, what I'm looking at is a preview of my entire graphic organizer. And because I'm starting this as a middle school assignment, I didn't want to have the students start from scratch. So I've taken the liberty of pre-populating or filling out some of these sections already, because I want to give students a little bit more of a focused exploration through this content. And this is one way that you can scaffold your students appropriately, depending on where they're starting from. So, in terms of differentiated instruction, you could even have a few different copies of this guide for different, for students with different needs in your classroom. And you could have them each kind of start at the level that's appropriate for them. So that's one way that you can kind of get your class going. So you can see I've already supplied them with our essential question here. And that essential question is, how will biofabrication impact the future of healthcare? And then I've given them some key terms that they're going to need to define along the way. So as we go through, we'll be adding in the definitions for these key terms. And students can also add additional key terms. So if they run into vocabulary that they're unfamiliar with, they can save that to their sort of personal glossary along the way here. And then as I scroll down further, you'll see I've also supplied them with the main event. And that's because I really want students to be focused on the causes of the main event and then subsequently the effects of the main event. So giving them that kind of main event to start from is another way that I'm kind of scaffolding them here. And then the rest is up to them. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay. So one thing I want to draw your attention to as we start on step one is you'll see that on the left-hand side, and actually I'll close my little preview window here just so we can focus a bit better. You'll see that I have the opportunity to customize this guide. And this is a feature that we've built in specifically for teachers. So if you notice up on the top side here, if you click on your little avatar, you'll see that it opens up your Google account and it has the opportunity to change your account type. So I'm just going to do that really quickly because you'll see what a student sees as they're progressing through the guide versus what a teacher sees. So if I change this to be a student, now I can see that my teacher, in this case me, has provided some specific instructions that go along with this step. So in this case, I'm introducing this concept of biofabrication to my class by giving them a quick video to watch. And you can see that I've actually embedded a YouTube video that gives a little bit of background on biofabrication that I want my students to watch as they get started on this guide. So you can put in any media, you can upload a link to an article here, a website, if you want them to visit a website for some background information. It's a great way to supply background knowledge as you're getting students ready to embark on this cause and effect guide. So in this case, this gives a little bit of background information on biofabrication. And then we go down and you'll see that I've already filled out the topic and the essential question for my students. Let's move on to step 2. All right. So in this case, I've given students another video that digs into the main event a little bit more. So they have the opportunity to continue to build their familiarity with the topic of biofabrication. And then I've given them the main event itself. Now, if you're working with older students or students who are more familiar with the content that you're teaching, you could certainly have them, fill in the main event themselves. But this is another way where I wanted just to give my students a little bit more familiarity with the topic. And for those of you folks for whom biofabrication is new, here's a little bit of a definition for you. So biofabrication is really the practice of 3D printing human tissue. So as the technology of 3D printing has evolved, we've figured out, and scientists really starting in the 1990s, so it's been been around now for like 30 years, people have been able to actually print human cells using stem cells and other sort of scaffold cells onto, they call them sort of like scaffold structures that allow the tissue to regenerate. And then those tissues can be actually transplanted into the human body without rejection because it's your own cells that you're using for the transplant. So it's amazing technology that's kind of evolving as we speak. And students are so into this because they think about it like, oh my gosh, do we really have the ability to, 3D print a kidney or 3D print a lung for somebody, or even 3D print a piece of bone for somebody that has a broken bone? So kids have always been really hooked on this particular piece of content and have gotten really engaged in learning more about this topic. So it's one of those really juicy STEAM content areas that can be really engaging for kids. So thinking about, what are the implications of biofabrication? How has medicine, dealt with the issue of transplants of organs before biofabrication existed, and what will happen as a result of biofabrication becoming more prevalent? So that's really what we're looking at here in this content. Let's move on to the next step. So in step 3, I have provided a little bit more specific customized instruction for my students. And what I'm asking them to do here is, as we explore the causes and effects, we're going to focus on 3 themes of biofabrication. And the first one is the quality of life for patients. The second is the availability of organs that, when somebody needs a transplant, can they get an organ? What is the availability for them, or do they have to wait? And then the third is the cost. What are the economic factors of having a chronic illness? So those are the themes that I'm going to give to my students to have them research in order to come up with the information they're going to need to fill out this guide. So for example, I'm asking students to basically add 1 cause per theme here. So for example, when I'm talking about quality of life for patients, I might want to focus on the fact that, millions of Americans are stricken with chronic illnesses, and how does that impact their quality of life? So for example, I could think about people that have kidney failure that have to go on dialysis, and they need to have dialysis like 3 times a week. So there are lots of different avenues that students could research in this area. So one example I have here is just a little bit of an explanation about chronic diseases. And this is also an opportunity where students can fill in media as well. So I could go on YouTube, for example, and I could pull out something like a a YouTube video and embed it here. There's a lot of different options for the types of media that you can add. So I'm going to pop in a, oops, that's not my link. Let me grab my link here. There's lots of types of content that you can add into the Corgi guides. So it doesn't have to be video. You could add in a diagram. You could add in a map. You can add in really any type of content that you want to add here. Let's see. I think I've got my link here now. Good. So you can see that I've found a little video on chronic disease published by the CDC. So I'm going to add that into my Corgi organizer. And that's my first cause. So in the interest of time, I would want to go through and add in a cause for each one of these themes that I've outlined here, but I'm going to move on to the next step just so we can take a look at the relationship. So moving on to step 4. Okay, so step 4 is asking the students to define the relationship between the causes and the main event. And that's a really important piece of figuring out, a cause and effect relationship, because you want to kind of understand what was the impact, that the cause had on the main event and really be able to name that. So one of the supports that's built into the Corgi tool is there are some options that are already pre-populated here. So students that may not be as familiar with this step have some choices, or at least a model, so they can kind of understand what is looking, what the step is looking for. But they can always overwrite that too. So if they don't see the correct connecting phrase that's really going to define that relationship, they can put in their own. So in this case, I think I may do that because I want to really say that it was the causes, the fact that people are suffering from chronic illnesses and the fact that there aren't enough organ transplants to go around and people end up on these long waiting lists. That really was the motivation for doctors and scientists and engineers to want to develop biofabrication in the first place. So I'm going to say these causes motivated the main event. And that's going to be my connecting phrase in this case. So this is a place where you can decide to kind of work through this step with students through explicit instruction as you first begin working on Corgi guides. And then as students get more familiar with the routine, they're going to understand how to define that relationship through the familiarity with the routine. So once they kind of, get some practice with this, it's going to be a little bit more familiar to them. So let's move on to the next step. And that's when we're looking at the effects. So what happens as a result of the main event, in this case, the invention of biofabrication. So we're going to revisit our 3 themes here. So I've got them listed for the students again in the direct instruction up here. And we want to rethink, okay, so now that biofabrication is available for people and it's coming online, it's becoming more available, what is that going to do for people's quality of life? What is that going to do for the availability of organs? And as it becomes, available in every hospital in America, which is the kind of dream of scientists that are working in biofabrication in the next, decade or two, how is that going to impact the cost? Right now, people that are on dialysis, it costs a fortune. It's one of the highest, costs of providing Medicare to people. So if they get a transplant instead using their own cells, that ongoing cost is eliminated. So there are all these different effects that may come as a result of biofabrication becoming more available to folks. So just as an example here, I have some options for kind of student responses. So I'm going to pop one of those into my effects. So going back to the theme of chronic illnesses, instead of just treating these diseases, the effect is they'd be actually cured, which is, a big difference in the quality of life for folks who are suffering from chronic illnesses right now. So students can imagine, what would that do to a person's life on a day-to-day basis if you didn't have to go and get dialysis anymore, if you could get a kidney transplant that had low risk of rejection and then be able to go on with your life and live the way, you did before you ever were sick. So big changes for folks. So that's one effect that we can add here. And, students can add up to 4 effects per per guide. So in order to add another one, you can just hit that button and you can stack up to 4. So we'll go through to the next step in this case, just in the interest of time. And this is, again, where students are defining that relationship. So if students are thinking about, okay, so we've got the main event happening and we've got our effects, what is that connection? What is that relationship called? So I've kind of already said it a few times here as I've kind of been describing this relationship. I'm going to say resulted in. I think one of the pre-added options here is going to work for me. So I'm going to pop that in there because I think that fits well. All right. So as we move on to step 7, this is where students are going to put it all together. And one of the nice things about Corgi is that anytime students want to revisit their progress, they can open up the full guide here and they can see their entire exploration all together. So they can go back through and think about, okay, I've started with my essential question. Well, we didn't add any of our key terms, but students can certainly do that. In fact, I'll just demonstrate here as you're going through. And of course, this is something that we would want students to be doing as they're conducting their primary research. So as they come across an article or a term in a video, they could potentially look that up. And we do have a built-in dictionary right in the tool. So if you highlight a word, and of course, biofabrication is probably too new to really even be in there. Let's try chronic. Maybe that's a term that's not familiar to some students. So they could open up the dictionary and get a definition right here. And then they could add that in just by opening up their key terms module and popping that in. So that's one way they can be collecting their vocabulary along the way. And we know that's so important for these sort of, new and emerging areas. There's tons and tons of vocabulary that goes along with them that's really going to, be a barrier for students if they don't have an understanding of the terminology. So we want to make sure we're clarifying that as we go. So then students can review their causes and the connections, the main event that they've been working from, and then the result and their effects. So now we're ready to circle back to our essential question and really think about, okay, can we respond to this essential question? Do we have the information we need? So in going back, I'm giving them a little bit more structure as they're talking through their summary and thinking about, okay, I just want to make sure I'm hitting all of the themes that we talked about here. And they have the ability to pop in that response. And that's where students are, putting the pieces all back together. And that's something that, again, comes with practice. After you use Corgi a few times, students get really familiar with, okay, I want to make sure I'm really just telling the story of this cause and effect relationship. And I can talk about the causes and then how the main event happened. And then what were the results? What were the effects of that? And students have kind of build that muscle of putting that together in a summary. And then the last step that students can do, which is optional, but it's a fun one, especially in this example, is the extensions. And that's where some students, if they're really looking for more enrichment, or if students are familiar with the content already and you want to give them something to build upon, you can add some additional enrichment questions here in the extension piece. So for this example, it's kind of a cool one. There's some questions about the ethics, like what's going to happen as biofabrication becomes more prevalent? And what if people start, kind of upgrading their bodies in a way that, we can't normally do? How is that going to impact things like, athletes competing in the Olympics and stuff like that? So there's some interesting questions that you could add for students to really kind of get them to critically think about this topic beyond where they've already gone. And then in the very last few moments that we have, one cool thing that I want to share with you about Corgi is the different ways that students can demonstrate their learning as they've gone through the routine. So students can post their work directly back to you. If you use Google Classroom, they can just post it through the app itself. They can print it out or save the entire thing as a PDF. Or what I really want to show you is the ability to create a slide presentation. So because we're working in the Google universe, this is all hooked up to Google Slides. And if I click this button, it's going to create a slide deck for me. It takes a few moments just to pull the information over. But what it's doing is taking all of the content that students have organized in their graphic organizer, including all the media, and put it into a slide deck. And we've learned from students that this structure is really beneficial for them when they go to do an oral presentation, because they feel like, you know, they've got the confidence that all of the information that they've researched is in a structure that makes sense to them. And now they can go through it methodically and really, you know, focus on the demonstration of the knowledge that they've collected. So that's a cool feature in Corgi. And we always say to students, you know, this is a starting point. We want you to go in and, you know, further edit this deck, and you can add more images, you can add more additional videos, you can kind of customize it and personalize it. You can even, you know, change the theme and change the look of your deck. So it's all customizable from here, but it gives students a great starting point to get going on their presentation if they choose to share their knowledge that way. So it looks like we're coming up on the end of our chat. So let me jump back over to our deck. And I just wanted to close out quickly by asking for your feedback. So if folks are interested in getting in touch with us, either with comments or questions, please email us at our email here that goes to our whole team, which is corgi@cas.org. Or if you're interested in working with us, we are recruiting teachers to be part of our spring pilot, where we're hoping to gather more data on the efficacy of Corgi. So if you are a middle school science teacher, we would especially love to hear from you. Jamie, do you want to throw anything in there about our recruitment efforts?
Not really, other than to say that we're really looking forward to working with people, and we've had some great feedback in the chat going on Zoom, and we're really appreciative for people who showed up and participated today, and we're really looking forward to working with folks. If you're wanting to use this in your classroom, especially middle school classrooms, we're really looking for some middle school teachers right now who want to try this out, maybe even receive a little extra bonus for trying it out in their classroom. So please get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you.
Well, thank you, everybody. We hope that you give Corgi a try in your classroom, and we'd love to hear how it goes. So please be in touch, and we hope to hear from you. So thanks so much for taking the time.